You know, the funny thing is, we've had conversations about Nell. We've had
Sure.
multiple conversations, and I'm sure you've done quite a bit of interviews about this, but I don't think I've ever heard you describe Nell to an audience. Can you do that for me? Can you tell
I
us a
could
little bit about
try.
how you see Nell?
I think sometimes when you know someone so well,
Uh
it
huh.
almost makes it harder to describe them.
Of course, yeah, yeah.
At least that's my husband's excuse for saying he can't do an impression of me. Uh, so, um, but for me, Nell is just this incredibly passionate person, both in good ways and bad ways. She's very hot tempered, but part of
Uh-huh.
that stems from how just passionate she is about human history and about just existing as a queer woman. That is like her main personality trait. But she also, she is just curious. Despite throughout the series, she's dragged kicking and screaming through a lot of these these
Yeah.
developments.
And even in
But
the last book, it's
yes,
still there.
exactly. But she still goes, and she still
Yeah.
is curious. She ultimately doesn't turn back, and I think that is just sort of inherent in her personality, and maybe
Mm.
she doesn't even know it. Um, Hence the kicking and screaming. So yeah.
I mean, how have you looked at her evolution, and how much have you been proud of the way that she's kind of developed?
I mean, I'm very proud of it. I think a lot of authors, go through this period, especially with series where there is these giant arcs, where they start to question themselves and start to wonder if the character is changing enough or she's changing too much sometimes.
Hmm.
um, and I definitely went through that, and I really feel like she has found herself. um, a lot of her personality early on in the series is defining herself as what she's not, and as she goes through, she sort of learns who she actually is, and defines herself by the things she does love, the things that she cares about.
And along those lines, there's an incredible found family that just comes about in this series. This series would not be, in my personal opinion, it would not be as engaging if she was left to her own devices, and without. I mean, her mom is one thing; she's always the anchor of these books, and then you come across people that she misjudges, and they become part of her family. And speak to those characters, the Emilios, the Dars. Lynn's a whole other discussion, but
Sure.
I mean, amongst those, and Zand and all these characters that come about, that come into this whole thing, uh, and what their involvement was for you in this.
Well, I'm a big side character fan. When I'm a reader and when I'm watching films, I think that side characters can really teach us things about the world and also
Mhm.
about the main characters in a way that you just can't show that through just a single lens. And though the books are, just third person, very, very Nell's perspective,
Mhm.
I wanted to be able to show a different way of interacting with this world, and responding to it. People who are very familiar with it or very familiar with certain parts of it. Dar and Lynn were both raised in this very high tech world,
Mhm.
and though Zand was too, it was a very different part of the world. He was raised on
Mhm.
this mining ship, in a very insular group. And then Emilio, is also from Earth, an Earthling, if you will, like Nell, but he has a very different perspective, in a lot of ways, on what that meant and how that can really impact how they interact with space and with these high tech people, both in good and bad ways. And I just felt like I couldn't show those parts of the world through Nell's eyes. Um,
Mhm.
Certainly not doing them justice. And I do have a few short stories, that I've both written and that I'm working on that go more into those characters from their perspectives because I
Mm.
couldn't help myself. So
Yeah, you have the ones about Lynn that are pretty
yes,
fascinating, and the
yes.
origin story of
Mhm.
basically her family, and
Mhm.
that's very interesting. So you're not completely saying goodbye to these characters then?
Not completely. I mean, Nell's story is finished,
Yeah.
more or less, and
Mhm.
I do want to return to the world. I had a few ideas, aside from just short stories here and there. I wanted to revisit it through a serial, actually, and I wanted to follow Jem, the med tech, who we saw a lot of in Fugitives. I wanted to sort of go through their arc, and
Yeah, I would love to see something with Amelia too. I think that would be amazing.
yes,
You know,
there's a short story that I'm working on, with him.
nice.
Yeah, he really grew on me. When I first started the series, he was a little bit more of an antagonist, and
Yeah.
I just sort of fell in love with him and with Dar as well, and their sort of budding relationship that blossomed into more.
You know, the structure of this series is very fascinating to me as well because the first book, which is just, I mean, it's a masterpiece. That is just for me the book of all books. It's one of my top 10 favorite books of all time. It's just
Thank
something
you.
amazing, and it's so cinematic. It is very Raiders of the Lost Ark. If with a touch of Star Wars at the end, right? But it's very cool, and then you kind of ground it a little bit, through drifters, fugitives, travelers, all these, and then then you get into space, and then it's all about space at that point, and going through this process and putting the different spins into different books. Was that a design you always wanted to follow, or was it just the characters and the situations bringing you there?
So Travelers was a standalone, originally. Which I don't know what I
That's
was thinking,
amazing.
because I can't write standalones apparently. Every time I do, there's like 12 more books. Then I obviously ended it on a cliffhanger,
Hmm.
much to a lot of people's horror, and I realized that, like all humans and like Nell, there was a lot more I wanted to explore,
Hmm.
and at that point I knew that there were going to be more books.
Hmm.
By the time I actually finished writing it, and once I was releasing it, and I honestly, it's sort of backwards. I picked the titles before I really had an idea of exactly
Interesting.
where the story was going to go. I knew I
Uh-huh.
wanted her to go into space,
Uh,
because I love space, and I knew that she'd hate it. Character development. So that's sort of where it started, was just finding these titles and finding just these seeds of where I wanted her to go.
mhm.
I'm not a plotter. When I'm actually writing, I have like a vague idea, and I mostly just word vomit. And
Mhm.
I don't write it chronologically. It's just the scenes that strike my fancy, and I often discover some of the minutia about these characters through that.
Mhm.
And when I get about a third of the way through, that's when I sit back. I'm like, okay, so where actually am I going with this? And then I'll do the outlines and get more into like the actual plot devices and the obligatory scenes that I know the genre needs.
The series ultimately is about redemption for every character involved. In some respect, they need to redeem themselves, whether it's amongst each other, whether it's within family, found family, whether it's the the bad guys redeeming themselves, kind of idea. Uh, was that kind of the goal and the emphasis for you? Did you feel like that was kind of where you wanted to take all of these characters and give them those arcs?
Yes, as an anthropologist, I wanted it to be a love letter to humanity.
Mm.
And humans are not perfect. And parts of that were a lot harder to write,
Mm.
as certain world events were happening. Um, and but I knew that core of hope in humans, and hope in how we treat each other,
Mhm.
was really the anchor of the writing. And part of that is redemption, and is
Mhm.
forgiveness, and is
Mhm.
forgiving oneself, definitely. And that was really the thread. I don't know if I knew that when I first started Travelers,
Mm. Mhm.
um, but by the
Probably not
end,
with drifters either.
no. But I started to realize that.
Uh-huh.
And as as Nell got over a lot of her anger management, you know, when I first started writing the book, I was a very different person. I was very angry, and it was sort of me trying to find the good in humanity.
Mhm.
And you know, that's why the first few books, well, I guess all of them, but why the first few books in particular were pretty dark, as you know, the outlook on humans, and how these two different factions were combining and interacting with one another.
So when did the idea of going back where it all began kind of come into play for you? Was that kind of something you just wanted to kind of bookend and kind of start from where you end where you started from, kind of idea?
Yeah, I'm a big cyclical person, and in my fantasy series too, the later two books mirror the first
Mm-hmm.
two books, but you know, with different outcomes. And so I knew that I sort of wanted to do that, and I always feel like coming back to where we started is something that we do a lot. Not often for the best. You know,
Yeah,
sometimes we have to play the
there
home.
is
Like,
that.
here we are again.
Yeah, well, there's that adage you can never go home again, right? So.
Yes, yes, and you know, I wanted to show that, but I I also wanted to show how when you do go back there, maybe you don't fit anymore, and maybe that's
Mm-hmm.
okay. Because I think that there are a lot of themes of like, oh, there's a sorrow in that, and you know, of course there
Mm-hmm.
is, but I
Mm-hmm.
wanted to show that there's also hope in that.
I love it. I love it. Okay. So we can't get away from talking about it. It is the elephant in the room. You know, uh, Nell and Lynn go through incredible roller coaster ride together, and ups and downs, splits aparts. You know, moments when they're not together and they're experiencing different things. This relationship and this idea of building this from the very beginning to where it ends up. Talk a little bit about that foundation and how you wanted that, how it kind of sprinkles out throughout the entirety of this series.
Mhm. I always knew that they would end up together. I mean, spoilers here. I didn't maybe know the extent to which Lynn would really go off the deep end there until maybe at the end of Drifters, and into Strangers. Um,
That early,
I,
that's pretty amazing.
yeah, I knew that she was a very complicated person,
Mm-hmm.
and incredibly hard on herself. And so, honestly, I wanted to show someone who loved people the way I love people, and not just like in a queer way,
Love
in
that.
the intensity way. Because oftentimes, I really fall for people, and you know, I'll move mountains for them, and a lot of people are actually uncomfortable with that. um, and so I wanted to show that, and but sort of from the other side. And a lot of Nell's insecurities are mine, but honestly, as a character, she's not that close to me. But I wanted to show how very different people can overcome different upbringings, and not just their environmental differences, and not just their challenges that they face as a couple, but challenges within their relationship, and betrayal, and how people can overcome those things, and learn to love one another again.
Mhm.
So that
How do
was
you
that
feel?
was sort of the anchor point there.
Mhm. How do you feel like do you feel like Emilio and Dar's relationship is kind of the mirror opposite, and that's kind of the kind of a good idea to have that kind of mirroring, that kind of giving example for I mean, Nell and Lynn never pay attention to it really, honestly, but I mean, it does kind of come up a couple times where these two guys who are just really just incredibly head over heels for each other, and forgiving and tolerant of one another for everything that they're how different they are. Is Was that kind of an idea that you needed an anchor like that to kind of, you know, that it can't be tumultuous like Nell and Lynn,
Right.
right?
Yeah, I mean, we can't have every relationship be be all, you know, fire and brimstone. Um, but I actually I didn't originally plan for them to be together.
Oh, okay.
It was the scene when Dar kisses Emilio, right after they find his uncle's body. That was sort of a surprise to me, but it made sense. It made
Nice.
perfect sense. And
Yeah.
think part of why it fits so well is because it was this mirror of Lynn and Nell, but also it showed Nell when she was like just basically full of what she felt was hatred for Lynn and anger. It showed her that two very different people can make it work, even though neither one of them is exactly like her or exactly like Lynn. It maybe planted that seed for her to realize that forgiveness and working past these things is possible.
You've been at this for a decade, my friend, and you've gone through a lot personally in your entire life. I'm curious, is there, I don't want to say relief because that's not fair, but there kind of just a kind of settling that this is over finally, that you can move on and do something different for you?
It really is. There really is, and relief might actually be a fair word in some ways, especially with there's a lot of changes on the publishing horizon coming next year.
Absolutely, sure.
Especially writing queer media.
Mm-hmm.
So it is nice to feel like I can pivot towards something if I need to, and not leave readers hanging. But what's kind of amazing is my career as an archaeologist. The year I started was the year I started writing travelers. And this year I left archaeology. I'm going back to school for something totally different. And though I would love to be able to continue archaeology, it's just not feasible. It doesn't pay the bills. But to end this series with the end of my career as an archaeologist was just way too fitting. I didn't really plan that way. It's the books were coming to a close, and so was my career. So I think that in some ways it's kind of perfect, and I'm looking forward to trying something different. But I learned so much. I learned so much through writing these characters and writing this world that I didn't really intend to, both as a writer and just as a person. And it's relief is there, and a little, it's always bittersweet. But I always feel like I have this surge of inspiration and momentum that comes at the end of a series, as if it was sort of trapped in there. And then when I release it out, it comes back to me. So.
Do you also feel like you it was kind of a good therapy for you, getting the aggression out and everything like that?
Yeah, I mean, I would joke that Nell, gets to say the things I can't. But it's mostly a joke, because I do have a tendency to say things maybe I shouldn't. But
I love, just on a side note, I loved in Emissaries that she stood up and did something very Nell-like, and that was like, it was because that was kind of getting tamed a little bit, and then all of a sudden there was that moment where she stands up and she wouldn't shut up, and that I was like, oh, that's so Nell, that's so great.
Yeah, she's still her, right? No, it definitely did serve as therapy in a lot of ways. Maybe not so much like through Nell, but like I said earlier, about having sort of reminding myself that humanity is worth it. And being able to really touch on that, especially when I was writing Heretics, the fourth book, I was 2 weeks to my deadline of like finishing it, submitting it to the editor, like done. And I had a full mental breakdown. I just had to pull away from writing completely for a year. And I think part of why that was so hard was I was in such a place of despair. It was 2021. We were coming off of 2020, the first wave of the pandemic, and we'd lost our housing. We'd fallen out with family, and it was just a very intense time. And I felt like I really couldn't write these stories in some ways because I was too close to it. And in order to find out how your character solves the problem, you kind of need to know how to solve the problem.
Sure.
So I think in some ways I just was unable to do that, and the drive to finish the story and return to Nell, I think, really helped drive me to get over some of those things and solve some of those problems in my own life. So
I'm curious what you would say to Nell right now if Nell came and approached you.
See,
Would you
that's
say?
terrifying. After all I put her through, oh my God.
Right,
No wonder she didn't kill me. I mean, first of all, I just want to know everything about space. But honestly, I think I'd hug her and I would try and let her cry. And I would want to know what she learned. Because I know what I think she learned. But you know, if she's a real person, I would want to know what her greatest lesson was throughout the stories.
I'm curious what you learned about you and writing in this process. What at the end of the day, when this is now it's all done. I know I've asked you this before, but I mean now we're done. This is the end. So I'm curious where you are at and what you feel like you've learned from finishing this series.
I have learned to let myself be weird and to let myself
Nice.
be, I there are a lot of points when you're writing where you start to think like, okay, like, is this too far? Especially if you're writing in a genre, a very like genre writing, writing in science fiction or writing in romance, or there's all these tropes that readers expect, or maybe don't quite fit with the genre, or and you always have to be asking yourself, is this in the right direction? Am I pushing it too far? Am I pushing it just enough? And knowing how to balance that. And I think this series really taught me how far to push it. And the question is really just keep going, I think. And so I'm really looking forward to, in my next books, getting weirder and getting darker and really getting into like the psychology aspects of things. Also, for God's sakes, please write a series Bible next time. I never do, and every time it's just like, good God. when I went to write, sort of the final read through, like plot wise for Emissaries, I had to go back and read through the rest of the series because, like you said, it's been a decade, and like those brain cells are so far gone. So I had to go through with my index cards and be like, okay, right, that's what happened, and oh, that's the character who said this, and like who pushed the big red button this time. Because honestly, I'd forgotten some of it, and not as much as I had actually feared once I read through it. But yeah, that was definitely a thing I learned was I need to keep better notes for my own self.
We are our hardest critics. I mean, obviously, my passion and love for this series, but for yourself, having to go back and reread through it, you're in a different spot than you were when you started.
It's hard sometimes.
Yeah, as a writer, I imagine you going, I'm such a better writer right now, and I wish I had done this and wish I had done that, right? But I'm curious, but we can talk about that all day long. I'm curious though, when you reread it, was there something that struck you that you go, I'm really proud that this happened, that I was able to do this? Was there something that you really loved about those early books?
I did. I mean, those were the hardest to read, because again, like you said, I've changed a lot as a writer, and I've tightened up my writing.
Yeah, sure.
But I think some of the scenes, when Nell has her turning points, when she decides ultimately to keep going, when she decides like, yes, I am going to go into space, just because this girl's really cute, those scenes, writing the emotional turning points, I was proud of those, and there were some lines that I sort of like, oh yeah, I did think that. Nice. Cool. And I'm a big fan of alliteration and metaphor, and so some of those I didn't cringe at. And that's sort of the biggest battle, right?
At the beginning too, it's very heavy-handed with grief, and grief is a theme throughout, but it kind of subtly separates itself from the real true themes of this series. Is that just you were at that time, that was where you were at, and then or did you feel like that needed to happen, where you needed to kind of pare it down a little bit and keep toward the real themes? And what was that in a discovery process for you?
A little bit. I had at one point, a former friend of mine who was also my my beta reader at the time, said like, okay, like we can't have 6 pages of despair because the reader is gonna go jump off a bridge. So and you know, she was joking, but she wasn't wrong.
Yeah.
And so part of it was that, and also, you know, grief gets softer as we go on. In 2014, when I was writing Travelers, my dad was very, very sick, and so I was getting to the point where, you know, his health was starting to decline. And it's interesting when you are watching someone pass. You know, not like in the moment, but you know, over a long period of time, because there is this sort of premature or is this grief that comes before they're actually gone. And I remember ultimately when he did pass in 2019, I had this thought of, you know, I've spent my whole life saying goodbye to this person, but I still don't know how. And I've been helping a friend through that same process. You know, the club you really don't want to belong to, but if you got to be there, at least there's someone else. And I think talking to her has really helped me hone how Nell would feel as this grief softens. And in some ways, there is grief that the grief is softening because that is your last connection to that person. So I sort of wanted to capture that with Nell. But you know, we can't just dwell there forever.
Yeah, no, and you're right. It does soften over time, and that does, and also how Nell deals with it also helps a lot too, because it's part of the plot line. So it's kind of, you know, you've changed a lot over the time periods when we've talked. But I'm curious, is that always going to be something you're going to include in your process? Are you always going to seek to do something with representation that is that super important to you going forward as an author?
I mean, I think even more so going forward. But not just these perfect stories, not just perfect queer people, because you know, no one's perfect. And I think a lot of us can try and hold ourselves to these standards to be the acceptable, the palatable queer person. So I'd like to write stories where the characters are imperfect. And that's sort of where Nell came from originally, was this, you know, angry, sometimes unlikable character in a lot of ways. But you know, she's still compelling, and she's still queer, and she's not going to go anywhere. So I definitely want to keep those themes going, among other ones, and maybe delve a little bit more into the weirdness of it. So